His daughter chose her before he did, and the Duke never quite recovered from it. Nobody warned Miss Octavia Fenwell that the child would be waiting at the top of the stairs. She had been told in the agency letter that Lady Josephine Fenbourne was 8 years old, serious beyond her years, and had dismissed 4 governesses in the past 12 months. She had not been told that Josephine would be standing on the 2nd floor landing in her nightgown at 11 o'clock in the morning, arms folded, dark eyes already conducting their assessment, with the precise expression of a magistrate who has heard this case before and is not inclined toward leniency. Octavia stopped at the foot of the stairs. She looked up at the child. The child looked down at her. Neither of them spoke for a full 10 seconds. Then Josephine said, with the measured gravity of someone who has made a considered decision, "Your boots are muddy. The last governess had perfect boots every single day and cried on her 3rd night. I could hear her through the wall." "I walked across the south field," Octavia said. "There was a botanical specimen I needed to examine. The mud was unavoidable." "What specimen?" "Digitalis purpurea. Foxglove. It grows along your east boundary wall. Somebody should tell your gardener. It's spreading toward the kitchen garden." Josephine was quiet for a moment. Then she descended 3 stairs. "The last governess didn't know what foxglove was." "Most people don't." "I do," said Josephine. "My mother taught me, before she died." The staircase held that between them. Then Josephine descended the rest of the stairs, walked past Octavia to the door, and said, without looking back, "Come and see the garden. I want to show you where else it's growing." Octavia followed. She did not yet know that the Duke of Stannick had been watching the entire exchange from the door of his study, that he had watched his daughter, who had not trusted a single person in 11 months, walk toward a muddy-booted stranger, as though she had always known the way. He stood in the doorway long after they disappeared into the garden, and something in him, armored and precise and carefully maintained, developed its first crack. England, 1853. The roses at Stanwick Hall bloomed every June without being asked, and the Duke of Stanwick tended his estate with the same impersonal efficiency, because both the roses and the estate required maintenance, and he was a man who honored his obligations. That was what 5 years of grief had made him, a man of complete, meticulous, entirely hollow obligation. His Grace Alaric Fenbourne, Duke of Stanwick, was 37. Broad-shouldered, dark blonde, with grey-blue eyes that had once been warm and were now simply watchful. He was not cruel, he was not cold by nature. He had become cold the way a house becomes cold when the fires are not lit, gradually without drama, until one morning you simply notice the temperature has changed. His daughter Josephine was 8. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's precision and an interior life of considerable depth that she shared with almost nobody, because almost nobody had shown themselves worthy of it. Miss Octavia Fenwell was 27. The daughter of a naval surgeon, she had been educated practically and broadly, supplemented her income through botanical illustration for a London scientific publisher, and took the position at Stanwick Hall not from necessity but from genuine interest. Specifically in the child, whose agency letter had been accompanied by a note, clearly written in a child's hand, slipped inside the envelope without explanation. "I know a great deal about plants. I would like to know more. The previous governesses did not know anything about plants." Octavia had packed within the hour. She arrived with muddy boots, 3 trunks of reference volumes, and no intention whatsoever of making herself smaller to fit a grieving household's expectations. The Duke had expected another governess. He had not expected someone who would walk into his house and, within 20 minutes of arriving, make his daughter trust her. He had not expected to find that more unsettling than anything that had come before. The east boundary wall was exactly where Octavia had said. The foxglove grew in a long, dense column along the stone. Tall spikes of purple-pink bells, beautiful and entirely toxic, leaning toward the kitchen garden with the patient ambition of something that has decided it belongs somewhere and is simply waiting for everyone to agree. Josephine showed her without ceremony. She walked ahead on the gravel path, her dark hair escaping its plait, her pinafore already acquiring the particular status of a garment that has had a thorough mourning, and she named things as she passed them. The lavender border her mother had planted 4 years ago, the cutting garden nobody cut from anymore, the sundial that had not told the correct time since the previous October when she dropped her father's pocket watch, trying to check if they agreed. Did they? Octavia asked. No. The sundial was 13 minutes slow. Papa's watch had stopped entirely. I thought that was interesting. It is interesting. Do you know why sundials are sometimes inaccurate? Josephine looked at her sidelong, a look Octavia would come to know well. The look of a child calibrating whether an adult intends to give a real answer or a simplified one. The equation of time, Josephine said carefully. The sun doesn't move at the same speed through the sky throughout the year. So a sundial and a clock disagree except on 4 days. Exactly right, said Octavia. Josephine stopped walking. She turned to look at Octavia fully, with the expression of someone who has just received confirmation of something they have been hoping for a long time. Miss Hartley said I was showing off when I said that. Miss Hartley, Octavia said, was wrong. They stood in the garden, the foxglove leaning between them in the warm June air. Then Josephine put her hand in Octavia's. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. Simply, the way a child reaches for something they've decided belongs to them. Behind them, from the window of the first-floor study, the Duke of Stannick watched his daughter's hand disappear into the new governess's, and felt the precise, unwelcome sensation of something he had carefully closed, beginning, without his consent, to open. She had converted the East Conservatory into an illustration studio by the end of her 3rd day. This was not, strictly speaking, within the parameters of a governess's remit. But the light in the conservatory was exceptional. North-facing glass that gave the flat, honest illumination that botanical illustration required. And the space had been, as far as Octavia could determine, entirely unused for the better part of 2 years. The plants inside it had the particular look of things that had survived on stubbornness alone. She moved the wrought iron table to the center, established her papers and her inks and her reference specimens, and was halfway through a detailed study of the foxglove bells when the door opened. The Duke of Stanwick had, it was immediately apparent, not expected to find anyone here. He was in his day wear, a dark wool coat, perfectly fitted, no concession to informality. And he carried a letter he had clearly been reading, which he lowered with the deliberate care of a man managing his own surprise. He was taller than she had understood from a distance. Broader. The grey-blue eyes assessed her work before they assessed her face, which she noted. "Miss Fenwell," he said. "I was not aware the conservatory had been repurposed." "The light is excellent," Octavia said, not looking up from the foxglove. "I hope you don't object. If you do, I'll find another space." A pause, the kind that measured something. "What are you drawing?" "Digitalis purpurea, the specimen from your east wall. I need accurate studies before I can write up the field notes. You write field notes. I illustrate for the Linnaean Society's botanical record. It's how I supplement my income. She looked up then, directly. I assumed the agency mentioned it. They mentioned you were qualified, he said. They were imprecise about the nature of the qualification. I taught Josephine the equation of time this morning, Octavia said. She already knew it. She was simply waiting for someone to confirm she was right to know it. The conservatory was very quiet. Through the glass, the June garden pressed its green warmth against the panes. The Duke looked at her illustration, at the precise, living accuracy of it, the foxglove bell rendered in every particular beautiful and true. She knew it already, he said quietly. Not a question. She knows a great deal already, Octavia said. She has simply been in rooms where knowing things was considered showing off. He said nothing, but he did not leave. He stood in the conservatory doorway for another full minute, looking at the illustration, before he folded his letter and went. And Octavia noticed, when he was gone, that she had been holding her pen very still for the duration. It happened in small ways first. Josephine began requesting that their morning lessons take place in the library rather than the schoolroom. The library, as it happened, was directly adjacent to the Duke's study, and the connecting door, though closed, was not particularly thick. Alaric, working through correspondence at his desk, found himself increasingly aware of the lesson in progress next door. Not intrusively, but as one becomes aware of music in another room. A consistent, organized sound that one begins without intending to listen for. He heard Josephine argue. Precisely, thoroughly, with evidence. He heard Octavia argue back. Not condescendingly, not with adult authority, but as an equal who happened to have more information and was willing to share it if challenged correctly. He heard his daughter laugh. The sound went through him like a change in weather. Then Josephine began leaving things. A botanical sketch she had made, slipped under the study door with a note. Papa, Miss Fenwell says this is Achillea millefolium. I drew it from the North Meadow. Do you know what it's called in English? The question was genuine. Alaric, who had not walked the North Meadow in 3 years, found himself looking up the answer. Yarrow. The answer was yarrow. He wrote it on a card and slid it back under the door. The following morning, he heard Josephine read his answer to Octavia, and heard Octavia say, "That's very good. Your father knows his wildflowers." "He knows a great deal," said Josephine, with the satisfaction of someone placing a chess piece. "He just doesn't always show it." Alaric put down his pen. He sat in his study and understood, with the clarity of a man who has underestimated his daughter, that he was being managed. The question was what, precisely, she was managing him toward. He found out on Thursday when Josephine appeared in his study doorway at 4 o'clock, and said with complete composure, "Papa, Miss Fenwell and I are taking tea in the garden. We thought you might like to join us." It was not a question, and Alaric, who had avoided the garden for 5 years, put on his coat. The garden table had been set with the good china. This was Josephine's doing. Octavia had simply carried the tray. When Alaric appeared at the garden door, coat on, the particular expression of a man who has agreed to something before fully thinking it through, Josephine was already seated and pouring with the gravity of a hostess 30 years her senior. "Papa, sit there." She indicated the chair across from Octavia. "Miss Fenwell has been explaining pollination, and I want you to hear it because you missed the part about bees." "I know the part about bees," said Alaric. "Do you know about the waggle dance? How bees communicate the location of flowers to the rest of the hive. They dance, said Josephine, with the triumph of someone who has been waiting to deploy this. "Miss Fenwell, tell him about the waggle dance." Octavia, who had been watching this exchange with the expression of someone who has correctly identified that she has been cast in a production without being given the script, looked at the Duke across the garden table. He had the look of a man who has not sat in this garden in a very long time. He was managing it, sitting straight, hands on the table, entirely composed, but something in the set of his shoulders suggested that composure was costing him more than usual, here, among the lavender his wife had planted. Octavia made a decision. "The waggle dance," she said, "is how a honeybee tells her colony precisely how far away a food source is and in what direction. She runs in a figure of 8, waggling her abdomen. The angle of the dance corresponds to the angle from the sun. The duration tells them the distance." "She tells them with her body," said Josephine, satisfied. "She tells them with her body," Octavia confirmed. Alaric was quiet for a moment. Then, "Who discovered this?" "Karl von Frisch, though he won't be born for another 40 years. It will take that long for anyone to look closely enough at what the bees are doing." The Duke looked at her. A proper look. Not assessing, not guarded. Simply looking. "You know things that haven't been discovered yet." "I know things that haven't been documented yet," Octavia corrected. "There's a difference. The bees have always known." Josephine refilled everyone's cups with the serenity of someone whose plan is working, and the Duke of Stanek, who had not voluntarily sat in this garden since the summer his wife died, poured his own second cup without being asked, and did not notice until much later that he had stayed for the better part of an hour. The Linnaean Society's regional meeting was held in the village assembly room on the second Thursday of every month. Octavia had been attending since her first week at Stanek, taking Josephine, who had requested to come on the grounds that she wished to see other people who cared about plants. The housekeeper, Mrs. Galloway, had expressed reservations. A governess attending scientific meetings was unconventional. A governess taking her charge to scientific meetings was considerably more so. Octavia had thanked her for the observation and gone anyway. The June meeting had not gone smoothly. Mr. Aldous Hearn, a local landowner with strong opinions about the proper scope of female intellect, had questioned, publicly, during the open discussion, the accuracy of Octavia's foxglove study, suggesting, with the confidence of a man who has never been seriously challenged, that her identification of a subspecies variant was in error. Josephine, sitting beside Octavia, had gone very still in the particular way she went still when she was deciding whether to speak. Octavia had addressed Mr. Hearn directly, by name, with evidence, citing 3 separate published sources and the precise morphological differences between the standard form and the variant she had documented. She was not unkind. She was not theatrical. She was simply completely, unarguably correct, and she said so in the same level tone she used to correct Josephine's Latin, attentive, without malice, and entirely without apology. Mr. Hearn had subsided. On the walk home, Josephine had been quiet for some time. Then, "You weren't angry." "No. You were right and he was wrong and you just said so, without getting upset." "Being upset would have been useful to him," Octavia said. "It would have let him argue about my emotions instead of my evidence. The evidence was what mattered." Josephine walked on for a moment. "I'm going to remember that," she said. That evening, Mrs. Galloway informed the Duke of the incident. Alaric listened without expression. When she had finished, he said, "Was she correct about the subspecies?" "I I believe so, Your Grace. Mr. Hearn did not dispute the sources. Then I have no objection, Alaric said, and returned to his correspondence. But that night he found himself at the conservatory door, not entering, simply standing, looking at the foxglove illustration pinned above Octavia's work table, thinking about a woman who won arguments by declining to make them personal and finding this more remarkable than he had words for. Lady Carnforth arrived on a Friday in July, ostensibly to call on a neighbour, genuinely to investigate. She was 61, politically sharp, and had been watching the Stanwyck household with the patient attention of a woman who has known Alaric Fenbourne since he was 8 years old and is not deceived by his composure. She had watched him close after his wife's death. She had watched Josephine become careful. She had sent 4 separate recommendations for suitable second wives over the past 2 years, each of which Alaric had declined with impeccable courtesy. She registered 3 things within her first quarter hour at Stanwyck Hall: that the conservatory had been occupied, that Josephine had joined them for tea without being summoned, and that when Octavia Fenwell entered the drawing-room to collect Josephine for their afternoon lesson, the Duke watched the door for a moment after it closed. Lady Carnforth stored all 3 observations and said nothing. She said something to Octavia, however, when she found her alone in the conservatory before leaving. "You know what people will say," Lady Carnforth said without preamble. "A young woman, unmarried, in a widower's household. Society has a fixed vocabulary for this situation." "Society has a fixed vocabulary for most situations," Octavia said, not looking up from her work. "That doesn't make the vocabulary accurate." "No, but it makes it dangerous." "To whom?" "To you, primarily. To him, secondarily. To the child, if this becomes complicated." Octavia set down her pen. She looked at Lady Carnforth fully, the direct, undeflected attention that had a way of making people feel both seen and slightly held to account. "I came here to teach Josephine," she said. "That is what I am doing. If I were to leave every position where society might manufacture a narrative, I would never work at all." Lady Carnforth studied her for a long moment. "He's watching his daughter trust you," she said finally, "in the way he has not watched her trust anyone since her mother died. He may not know yet what that means to him. But I do." She left without further comment. Octavia sat in the conservatory after she'd gone and found that her hands, which were generally steady, had acquired an unwelcome tremor she had no satisfactory explanation for. She found the portrait by following Josephine. The child had a habit of going to the long gallery on Tuesday evenings after supper. Octavia had noticed it in the 3rd week and said nothing, because some things require the privacy of being unobserved. But on the 4th Tuesday, Josephine had paused at the gallery entrance and looked back, and Octavia had understood she was being invited. The gallery was long, north-facing, cool even in July. The portraits of 3 centuries of Fenbournes watched them from the walls with the equanimity of people who have outlasted everyone they ever knew. The one at the far end was recent, a woman of 30, painted in a gown of pale gold, with dark eyes and an expression of particular warmth, the kind of warmth that does not perform itself but simply is. Josephine stopped in front of it and folded her arms in the way she folded them when she was managing something large. "That's my mother," she said. Her name was Catherine. She knew all the garden plants by their Latin names. She said Latin made them easier to remember because the names told you something true about them. "That's exactly right," Octavia said quietly. "Papa won't come to this end of the gallery," Josephine said. "Not since she died. I think he's afraid that if he looks at her, he'll stop being able to manage. The gallery held that between them. Managing is very tiring, Octavia said. Yes, he's very good at it. Josephine looked at her mother's face with the steady, unsentimental gaze of a child who has been doing her own managing for a long time. Miss Fenwell, do you think people can forget how to be happy? Not on purpose, just gradually, because they get out of practice. Octavia looked at Catherine Fenbourne's painted warmth and thought about a man who walked through a house full of things his wife had loved and touched none of them. I think they can get out of practice, she said carefully. I think sometimes they need something, or someone, to remind them that the practice is still possible. Behind them, from the gallery entrance, there was a sound. Not a footstep, but its absence. The particular quality of someone who has stopped moving. They did not turn around. But when they left the gallery 20 minutes later, the door at the far end, which had been closed, was very slightly ajar. And Octavia, who noticed details the way she noticed botanical specimens, completely without editorializing, said nothing and understood everything. It began with the village school. There was a small school in the village that served the estate's tenant children, adequate in provision, limited in scope. Octavia had visited it in her 4th week, noted 3 children of exceptional ability, receiving no instruction beyond basic literacy, and had begun, quietly and without announcement, supplementing their education on Saturday mornings at the conservatory. The Duke discovered this from his land steward, who had discovered it from the housekeeper, who had heard it from the gardener's wife. He found Octavia in the conservatory on a Saturday afternoon after the children had gone. She was cleaning inks. She looked up when he entered and waited, because his expression told her what was coming. "You have been bringing tenant children to the house," he said, 3 of them on Saturday mornings, with Mrs. Galloway's knowledge, though not her enthusiasm. "You did not ask my permission." "No," Octavia said. "I judged that asking might produce a refusal, and the children's education seemed more important than the protocol." A silence. His jaw had the particular set of a man who has been managed and knows it, and is uncertain how he feels about that. "That is not— I know it is not the conventional approach," Octavia said. "I also know that one of those children, a boy named William, 8 years old, son of your North Farm tenant, has a mathematical facility I've not encountered in 20 years of teaching. He's going to spend his life in a field unless someone intervenes. I chose to intervene." The conservatory was very still. "You should have told me," Alaric said. "You should have been easier to tell," Octavia said, not unkindly but without any softening. "You are a man who has made himself very difficult to approach on any subject that is not already on your desk." The silence this time was a different quality entirely. "That is a significant thing to say to an employer." "Yes," said Octavia, "but I think you have had too many people around you who only said manageable things." He looked at her for a long moment. This direct, unwavering, entirely self-possessed woman who had been in his house for 2 months and had reorganized the conservatory, restored his daughter's trust, corrected a landowner in public, and was now telling him truth about himself that nobody had thought to say in 5 years. "The boy's name is William," Alaric said at last. "You said he has a facility for mathematics." "Exceptional facility." "I'll speak to the village schoolmaster on Monday," he said, and left. Octavia stood in the conservatory, looking at the space he'd vacated, and understood that he had not conceded. He had simply moved in the direction she had pointed, which she was beginning to learn, was how Alaric Fenbourne expressed that he agreed with you. It was raining. The kind of rain that settles in for the day. Grey, thorough, without drama. Josephine had declared lessons suspended on the grounds that the weather demanded something other than Latin, and had spent the morning conducting what she described as an important audit of the conservatory's reference library, which in practice meant sitting on the floor reading botanical monographs and asking questions when she found something she did not understand. Octavia worked at the illustration table. The Duke passed the conservatory door twice, both times with correspondence, both times slowing very slightly before continuing on. Josephine noticed both times. She said nothing on either occasion. She was waiting. At 11:30, she put down her monograph and looked at Octavia with the expression of someone who has arrived at a decision. "Miss Fenwell, do you like my father?" Octavia continued working for exactly 3 seconds. Then she set her pen down. "I respect your father a great deal," she said carefully. "That's not what I asked." "Josephine." "I'm 8, said Josephine. "Not 4. I can see when adults are being careful instead of being honest." She pulled her knees to her chest, very composed. "I liked you from the first day, because you knew about the foxglove and you didn't talk to me like I was fragile. And I think Papa likes you too, except he doesn't know what to do about it because he hasn't liked anyone since Mama died, and he's forgotten what it's supposed to feel like." The rain moved across the conservatory glass in slow rivers. "You're very perceptive," Octavia said quietly. "I know," said Josephine. "Is it terrifying?" "Slightly," Octavia admitted. Josephine unfolded herself and stood up with the brisk efficiency of someone who has finished one part of a task and is moving to the next. "I'm going to ask Papa to walk with me to the east wall," she said. "I'm going to ask you to come as well. You're going to see the foxglove, which has grown another 6 inches since you measured it. And if the two of you manage to have a conversation without either of you being careful instead of honest, that will be very satisfactory." She picked up her coat. "I'm told this is what people do when things need to happen and the adults are taking too long. They arrange circumstances. I read it in a novel of Mama's. I thought it seemed sensible." She left to find her father. Octavia sat in the conservatory in the rain-grey light and felt the particular, unwelcome, entirely welcome sensation of someone who has been seen completely and found, despite their best efforts, to be exactly themselves. The foxglove had grown exactly 6 inches since Octavia's first measurement. Josephine confirmed this with a measuring string she had brought for the purpose, recorded the figure in a small notebook she had designated the East Wall Botanical Record, and then announced with the composure of a general who has executed a campaign to her satisfaction that she was going to check on the cutting garden and would return in 20 minutes. She disappeared down the path before either adult could suggest otherwise. The east boundary wall in July was a different thing from the east boundary wall in June. The foxglove was fully committed now, a column of deep purple bells, complex and exact, each individual bloom a precise architecture of evolutionary intent. The wall was warm stone behind them. The garden smelled of lavender and recent rain. They stood side by side looking at the foxglove for a moment. "She planned this," Alaric said. "From the beginning, I think," Octavia agreed. "Possibly from the day I arrived. She's 8 years old. She's formidable." A pause. "A real one. The kind that contains something." "I stood in the gallery doorway," Alaric said. 7 weeks ago, Tuesday evening. You did not turn around." "I know. You heard what Josephine said." "Yes." Another pause. He was looking at the foxglove with the focused attention of a man working something out. "I've not been able to walk to that end of the gallery since Catherine died," he said. "I've stood at the entrance perhaps a dozen times and gone no further. That evening I walked the full length." He paused. "I don't know what to do with the fact that it was what you said to her that made it possible." "You don't need to do anything with it," Octavia said. "It simply happened. Most things that matter simply happen, if the conditions are right." He turned to look at her then. The full, direct look she had seen him give only to things he was genuinely trying to understand. The botanical illustration, the letter from William's father, the equation of time. "Miss Fenwell, Octavia, I have been not present for a long time. Not absent in the obvious ways. Present in the house, present at the table, present in all the obligations, but not—" He stopped. Tried again. "Josephine noticed before I did. You arrived and she simply chose you. And I watched her do it and understood that she was right, that she had seen something true." "What did she see?" "Someone who doesn't perform her honesty," he said. "Someone who simply is. And I've been performing composure for 5 years, and I'm very tired of it." The foxglove moved very slightly in the summer air. "I came here for Josephine," Octavia said. "That was true when I arrived, and it is true now. But I would be dishonest if I said she is the only reason I have stayed." He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with speeches or ceremony, with the same simple directness that Josephine had used on the first day. The gesture of someone who has made a decision and is simply acting on it. "I'm going to need a great deal of practice," he said, "at being present, at not managing, at saying true things instead of careful ones." "I know," said Octavia. "I'm not known for my patience with imprecision." A pause. "But I am willing to make an exception for work in progress." Down the path, Josephine appeared from the direction of the cutting garden, walking with the studied casualness of someone who has definitely not been watching from behind the lavender hedge for the past several minutes. She saw their joined hands and stopped. Then she raised both of her own in a small, private gesture of profound personal satisfaction, and walked back toward the house, because some things are best given space to become themselves. The foxglove had spread again, this time by design. Josephine had transplanted a careful selection of specimens along the south wall of the cutting garden in October, working with the head gardener and a level of botanical precision that had earned her, at 9 years old, the gardener's professional respect and a designated plot she could manage independently. She had documented every transplanting in the East Wall Botanical Record, which had been expanded by 2 notebooks and was beginning to constitute what Octavia described, without exaggeration, as a serious contribution to the household's ecological history. The conservatory had been expanded, not dramatically. A lean-to addition along the east face, glass-roofed, with a south-facing bench for winter work. It had been Alaric's suggestion, offered during a morning when Octavia had been trying to fit 3 ongoing illustration projects and 2 of William's mathematics worksheets onto a table designed for one occupation at a time. He had said it the way he said most things now, directly, without the performance of composure, with the slightly unguarded quality of a man who has been practicing presence and is finding it, against his initial estimation, more sustaining than its absence. The marriage had been small. Josephine had been the only witness necessary, in her opinion, and had said so. In practice, there had also been Lady Carnforth, who had arrived at the church with the expression of someone who has been proved correct and is being gracious about it, and Mrs. Galloway, who had cried, which surprised everyone, most of all Mrs. Galloway, William, the North Farm tenant's son, had been enrolled in the village school's advanced stream and was currently demonstrating, with some force, that his facility for mathematics extended to geometry. Alaric had spoken to the village schoolmaster. The village schoolmaster had spoken to the county education board. Things were in motion, slowly, as things tended to be, but moving. On a morning in July, the 2nd July since Octavia had arrived at Stannick with muddy boots and 3 trunks of reference volumes, she found Alaric in the gallery. Not at the entrance. At the far end, standing in front of Catherine's portrait with his hands in his coat pockets and an expression on his face that was not grief, or not only grief, but something more complex, more honest, more like the face of a man who is no longer managing. She did not speak. She stood beside him. After a moment he said, "She would have liked you." "I hope so," Octavia said. "I would have liked her. Anyone who taught Josephine the Latin names of plants before she could read properly is someone I would have liked." "She taught her the equation of time as well," Alaric said. "I didn't know that until Josephine told me. Last spring." "That explains a great deal." "It does." He was quiet for a moment. "Josephine said something to me, months ago. She said I'd gotten out of practice at being happy, that I needed someone to remind me the practice was still possible." He glanced at Octavia sidelong. The look she had come to understand was the look he gave things he was genuinely grateful for. "She was right." "She frequently is," Octavia said. "Insufferably so," Alaric agreed. From the direction of the conservatory, distantly but unmistakably, came the sound of Josephine in argument with the head gardener about the correct classification of a specimen she had found in the North Meadow. The gardener was losing. This was audible from the gallery. Alaric offered Octavia his arm. She took it. They walked together out of the gallery, through the house, and into the July garden, where the lavender was in full expression and the foxglove stood along the south wall in purple bell columns, exact and particular and precisely, correctly itself. Josephine, emerging victorious from the conservatory, with the gardener trailing behind in the manner of a man revising his understanding of 9-year-old naturalists, saw them and did not wave. She simply looked for the length of one satisfied breath and then turned back to her specimen. She had chosen correctly. She had always known she would. And the Duke of Stanwick, who had not smiled properly in 5 years, who had stood at the gallery entrance a dozen times and gone no further, who had managed everything and felt almost none of it, walked into the summer garden with his wife and smiled at something she said, and did not notice it was remarkable, because it had become, in the way of things that are finally, rightly restored, simply ordinary, which was, of course, the whole point. If this story reached you, if you have ever been chosen by a child before the adult caught up, or if you have ever been the one who got out of practice at being happy and needed someone to remind you it was still possible, leave a word below. We read every one. Subscribe for a new story every week. The next garden is already waiting to be walked.